I'm telling you now that Adam is awesome. You couldn't ask for songs that went any better with the lesson this morning. And so I hope that you'll be thinking about those words of the songs that we just sang as we're going through this lesson this morning. Open up your Bibles, please, to Numbers chapter 11. Numbers chapter 11. Numbers 11 is going to be a great spot for you to be in. I think pretty much the entire time we're going to be in Numbers 11. On the back end of our study this morning, we're going to mention a few verses in the New Testament and talk about some New Testament applications, but the vast majority of our study this morning is going to be going through Numbers chapter 11. And so while you're turning to Numbers 11, just to give you some context, God had delivered Israel out of slavery from Egypt. And you think about the wonders that God did to deliver them out of the slavery of Egypt. And God led them, as we just sang in that song, God led them in a pillar of fire, a pillar of cloud to Mount Sinai. And on Mount Sinai, God gave Moses the law, the ordinances for the people, how the nation was to live, things like that. They received the full law of God, and they stayed there for about a year. So they were at Mount Sinai for about a year. And then in Numbers chapter 10, we see they get to leave Mount Sinai for the first time in a year. And Numbers 10, verse 33 says they went 3 days' journey. So I want you to think about, for these Israelites, they had spent an entire year at this mountain, and now something new and exciting is happening. God is leading them out away from Mount Sinai and leading them toward the promised land. So if you think about times in your life when things have been new, it's exciting. Things are happening, things are rolling. Let's go. Everybody's kind of excited about what's happening and looking forward to what the future is going to bring. But as I'm sure a lot of us know as well, fickle human nature sometimes takes over very quickly. Things seem great when it's new. Things seem awesome while stuff is happening, but fickle nature can take over so quickly. So what we're going to talk about this morning is some complaints in the wilderness. Complaints in the wilderness. And I think we're going to find that as we read through Numbers 11 and we talk about how mankind relates to God, that we are so unbelievably similar to these Israelites here. So let's read through this chapter together. We'll take it in chunks and we'll talk about it as we go. Let's start in verse 1, please. Numbers 11, verse 1. Now the people became like those who complain of adversity in the hearing of the Lord. And when the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. The people therefore cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire died out. So the name of that place was called Taberah, because the fire of the Lord burned among them. The rabble who were among them had greedy desires, and also the sons of Israel wept again and said, "Who will give us meat to eat? We remember the fish which we used to eat free in Egypt, the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the onions and the garlic. But now our appetite is gone. There is nothing at all to look at except this manna." Now the manna was like coriander seed, and its appearance like that of bdellium. The people would go about and gather it and grind it between two millstones, or beat it in the mortar and boil it in the pot and make cakes with it. And its taste was as the taste of cakes baked with oil. When the dew fell in the camp at night, the manna would fall with it. So we aren't told right away here in these first 9 verses, but in Numbers chapter 10, verse 33, we notice they had just gone 3 days' journey away from Mount Sinai. Things are exciting. Things are new. They're headed toward the promised land. It seems like just a little bit after 3 days' journey from this mountain, heading toward the promised land, what do the people immediately start doing? They start to grumble. They start to complain. That fickle human nature just really comes on fast. And to be fair to these people, you think about the region of Mount Sinai, that's a relatively fertile area. So, you could see, okay, there's plants here. Maybe there's food that's going to grow here. But if you go 3 days' journey away from Mount Sinai toward the promised land, you know what you're going to encounter is desert. They're just in a desert place. So to be fair, they're looking around and it's just desert. And they're wondering, what are we going to do for food? We want food. We want meat. It says specifically that they were wanting some meat here in a little bit. But God is right to be angry with these people. He hears them complaining. He hears them murmuring. And it says in verse 1 that his anger was kindled and the fire of the Lord burned among them, consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. It's not clear if that's just bushes or if that's tents or if that's people, but everybody there knew this is a sign from God and we have messed up, because the people, they cry out to Moses. Moses prays to the Lord and the fire dies out. I mean, thank God that he relented from his anger and didn't just consume all of them. He would have been completely right to do that, but he doesn't do that. So they called that place Taberah, which means burning, because the anger of the Lord burned there. But then we got to verse 4, and it says the rabble who were among them, and rabble could just be people who were complaining and murmuring about the lack of what they wanted there, or it could be people who were not Israelites. That word can also mean people who weren't Israelites. And we see the rabbles mentioned, and we see the sons of Israel. They were weeping. Do you see that, verse 4? These people are weeping, and they're saying, who will give us meat to eat? Who will give us meat to eat? They remember back in Egypt, they say, oh, we had such fish, cucumbers, these melons, the garlic, the onions, the leeks, all these things that they got to eat freely from Egypt, which I don't think is a fair representation of how they were eating in Egypt at all. But they say, now our appetite is gone. There's only one thing to look at, and that's this manna that God keeps providing for them. If you think about the manna that God had provided for them, the writer of the book of Numbers seems to really point out that these people are being really dramatic. Did you notice that? We think it's Moses who wrote this because immediately after hearing or reading what these people just said, Moses starts talking about what that manna was like. And he says in verse 7, the manna was like coriander seed. Its appearance was like that of bdellium. If you were in the adult Bible class this morning, you know that in the Garden of Eden, bdellium was there. And the Garden of Eden was a perfect place that God put man into. So bdellium is a precious, good thing. And Moses says, manna looked like bdellium. Like this is a good thing that God was providing to us. And it says the people would go out and gather it. They'd grind it. They'd make cakes. And it was like the taste of cakes baked with oil. And every night when the dew fell on the camp, the manna would fall with it. So you think about what it was like to eat at this time period. They either had to plant it, tend a garden, wait for it, and hope that it would produce crops and they could eat those things. They had to kill an animal, whatever it is. They had to do a lot of work just to eat. But here, God is providing something. They wake up in the morning and it's there. They didn't have to plant it. They don't have to wait for it to grow. They don't have to tend a garden. It's there every morning. It's available to them. They have to go out and gather it. They have to prepare it. But compared to the work of every other type of food in this time period, this is easy. This is literally cake. Right? They said it tasted like cakes with oil. And over in Exodus chapter 16, it says that it was like wafers with honey. I mean, this is good. What God is providing to them is good. And he does this day in and day out. He's just so good to them to do this. But the people are complaining. They want meat to eat and they want some variety. And to be fair again, they've been eating manna for about a year. I know we all like variety when we eat. So to be fair, they were eating manna for a year. They wanted some variety. However, the stuff that God was providing for them, this manna was good. It was a very good thing that he was doing there. But let's keep reading. Look at verse 10. Look at verse 10. Now Moses heard the people weeping throughout their families, each man at the doorway of his tent, and the anger of the Lord was kindled greatly, and Moses was displeased. So Moses said to the Lord, why have you been so hard on your servant? And why have I not found favor in your sight, that you have laid the burden of all this people on me? Was it I who conceived all this people? Was it I who brought them forth, that you should say to me, carry them in your bosom as a nurse carries a nursing infant to the land which you swore to their fathers? Where am I to get meat to give to all this people? For they weep before me, saying, give us meat that we may eat. I alone am not able to carry all this people because it is too burdensome for me. So if you are going to deal thus with me, please kill me at once. If I have found favor in your sight, and do not let me see my wretchedness. So Moses, in these verses, Moses hears the people literally weeping about wanting meat and wanting variety in their food. And he just vents out his frustrations to God. And the things that he says, I don't know, they kind of seem a little edgy, I would say. I think if somebody came up here and prayed a prayer to God in this assembly, the way that Moses said this, I think we might be shifting a little uncomfortably in our seats. Like, oh, I don't know if we can talk to God like that. Well, Moses says, why have you burdened me with this people? Why have you done this to me? I can't carry these people alone. And he says, did I conceive these people? Was it I that did all these things? And then I love verse 12. He says, why did you say to me, carry them in your bosom as a nurse carries a nursing infant to the land which you swore to give to your fathers? Moses is calling them babies. He's like, why am I the nursemaid? Why am I like the foster father carrying around these babies? I can't handle these people. And so Moses says, verse 15, if you're going to deal with me like this, just kill me at once. Just kill me. It'd be better for me to die than to try to lead these people by myself. I can't do this, is what Moses says. And again, I don't know if I were to come up here and pray this prayer, I think we'd all be a little bit like, okay, he's a little out there today. I don't know what's going on. But then we get to see God's reaction to this, and I love his reaction. Let's see, because God has an answer and a solution for both of the problems that Moses brings up. Because Moses also lifts up, where am I supposed to get meat for these people? He says, these people are too much for me to bear. I can't leave these people alone. And where am I supposed to get meat for these people? God has an answer to both of those questions. Look at verse 16, please. Verse 16. The Lord therefore said to Moses, gather for me 70 men from the elders of Israel, whom you know to be elders of the people and their officers, and bring them to the tent of meeting, and let them take their stand there with you. Then I will come down and speak with you there, and I will take of the Spirit who is upon you, and will put him upon them. And they shall bear the burden of the people with you, so that you will not bear it all alone. And before we keep going, one of the things I love about this, verses 16 and 17, again, if I were to pray this prayer in the assembly here, everybody be kind of like, I don't know if you can talk to God like that right now, man. I don't know if you can do that. But Moses cries out his legitimate frustrations to God. And God doesn't say, how dare you approach me that way? How dare you tell me these things? I appointed you leader of the people. You lead them. He doesn't do that. God says, go get 70 men. Go get 70 men who you know are elders of the people. And I'm going to take from the Spirit that's on you and give it to them. And they will help you carry this burden. They will help you lead these people. God answers that prayer. He tells him what to do. He provides provision so Moses doesn't have to do it by himself. And I love that. So one of the lessons there is we can cry out to God with our frustrations and our vents, and God will hear us. And maybe even if we're a little disrespectful, or if we're like coming at him in a way that God really doesn't deserve, God hears our complaints and the things that we need, and he provides for them, which we're going to talk about more. And I love that. That's what God does. He answers the first problem. He provides a solution. So now let's see God's solution to the next problem. Look with me at verse 18, please. Verse 18. Say to the people, consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow you shall eat meat. For you have wept in the ears of the Lord, saying, oh, that someone would give us meat to eat, for we were well off in Egypt. Therefore, the Lord will give you meat, and you shall eat. You shall not eat, or you shall eat, not 1 day, nor 2 days, nor 5 days, nor 10 days, nor 20 days, verse 20, but a whole month, until it comes out of your nostrils and becomes loathsome to you, because you have rejected the Lord who is among you, and have wept before him, saying, why did we ever leave Egypt? Verse 21, but Moses said, the people among whom I am are 600,000 on foot. Yet you have said, I will give them meat, so that they may eat for a whole month. Should flocks and herds be slaughtered for them to be sufficient for them? Or should all the fish of the sea be gathered together for them to be sufficient for them? The Lord said to Moses, is the Lord's power limited? Now you shall see whether my word will come true for you or not. So after God answers the problem of leading the people and being a burden on Moses as one person, he answers, says, get 70 men and they'll help you. They will carry the burden with you. Now he answers the second problem, where Moses cried out, where am I going to get all this meat to feed these people? And God says, consecrate yourself, because tomorrow you're going to eat meat. But he doesn't just stop and say, tomorrow you're going to eat meat. This is one where, okay, the way that these people have been acting and their attitudes is not okay in the sight of God, because he says he has heard their, verse 18, he heard them weep in the ears of the Lord, say, oh, that someone would give us meat to eat, and that they were better off in Egypt. So he says, okay, you're going to get meat and you're going to eat. Not 1 day, not 2 days, not 5 days, not 10, not 20. He says, you're going to eat for a whole month until it comes out of your nostrils. How vivid is that? And it becomes loathsome to you. So it's almost like God is saying, okay, manna has become loathsome to you because you get this every day. So you want meat? I'll give you meat. And you're going to eat it for a month until it's coming out of your nostrils and you're sick of it. Be careful what you wish for, right? He's going to give them meat to eat. And he says the reason why, verse 20, because you have rejected the Lord among you, and you've been saying we were better off in Egypt. So it's not really the meat. It's not really about the people wanting meat. It's because they rejected God and their hearts were in Egypt when their hearts should have been with God. But Moses here, Moses doubts God in what he just said. Did you see that in verse 21 and 22? He says, these people among whom I am, we're 600,000 people on foot. You said we're going to eat meat for a month. How am I supposed to get all that meat? How am I supposed to make this happen? He said, should all the flocks, should all the herds be slaughtered? Should we get all of the fish of the sea and use that to feed these people? How are we going to do this? And I love God's answer. Verse 23, he says, is the Lord's hand short? Your version might say, is the Lord's arm weak? Is the Lord's arm short? The New American Standard says, is the Lord's power limited? And I love that. This is a rhetorical question if there ever was one. God's asking, do you think that I'm insufficient? Do you think that I'm not enough to provide and do the things that I say? And this is Moses we're talking about. I mean, think about all the things Moses had seen and talked to God and all the things that Moses had done doing the works of God. And yet he's like, I don't know how we're going to provide all this meat. And God says, is my hand short? And he says, just watch. You watch, and you're going to see what I'm going to do for this people. You see what I'm going to do. Okay, so let's keep reading here. Verse 24. So Moses went out and told the people the words of the Lord. Also, he gathered 70 men of the elders of the people, and he stationed them around the tent. Then the Lord came down in the cloud and spoke to him, and took of the Spirit who was upon him, and placed him upon the 70 elders. And when the Spirit rested upon them, they prophesied, but they did not do it again. But 2 men had remained in the camp. The name of one was Eldad, and the name of the other, Medad. And the Spirit rested upon them. Now they were among those who had been registered, but had not gone out to the tent, and they prophesied in the camp. So a young man ran and told Moses and said, Eldad and Medad are prophesying in the camp. Then Joshua, the son of Nun, the attendant of Moses from his youth, said, Moses, my Lord, restrain them. But Moses said to him, are you jealous for my sake? Would that all the Lord's people were prophets, and the Lord would put his Spirit upon them. Then Moses returned to the camp, both he and the elders of Israel. Okay, so here in verses 24 through 30, we see those 2 problems that Moses had lifted up to God. Those 2 problems. One, I can't lead these people alone. God says, get 70 people. I'm going to take the Spirit from you and put it on them. That's exactly what God does. The 70, actually not 70, 68 of them come to the tent of meeting, just like Moses had said. The cloud of glory descends here. The Spirit goes away from Moses. Part of it goes away from Moses and goes on to these 68 men. But there were 2 men who are specifically mentioned, Eldad and Medad, who were supposed to be there, who did not obey what God told Moses to tell them to do. But what's amazing about this is God's power is not limited by man's obedience. Because you see, these 2 men, they didn't go to the tent of meeting like they're supposed to. They're just among the camp of Israel. And yet, the Spirit still came on them, and they were prophesying. And these men prophesied, but it says at the end of, verse 25, they didn't do it again. It was just this occasion. This is a special occasion for these men. So they're prophesying, and a young man comes to tell Moses, hey, these 2 guys are prophesying in the camp. And Joshua's like, Moses, you got to stop them, restrain these men. And Moses is like, oh, I wish that everybody had the Spirit of the Lord on them. Would that everyone had God's Spirit in them, which we could talk about that for a while, because if you're a Christian today, Spirit is in you right now. It's amazing. Anyway, but at this time, just these 70 and Moses. And so God fulfills what he said he was going to do. He said, I'm going to take the burden away from you and share it with these men. You'll be able to lead these people with these men. But now we get to the meat problem. So let's see God's answer to this problem. Look at verse 31, please. Verse 31. Now there went forth a wind from the Lord, and it brought quail from the sea, and let them fall beside the camp, about a day's journey on this side, and a day's journey on the other side, all around the camp, and about 2 cubits deep on the surface of the ground. The people spent all day, and all night, and all the next day, and they gathered the quail. He who gathered least, gathered 10 homers, and they spread them out for themselves all around the camp. While the meat was still between their teeth, because before it was chewed, the anger of the Lord was kindled against the people. And the Lord struck the people with a very severe plague. So the name of that place was Kibroth Hattaavah, because they buried the people who had been greedy. From Kibroth Hattaavah, the people set out for Hazeroth, and they remained at Hazeroth. So we see in these verses where there's this wind from the Lord, and it carries these quail to the sea and all around the camp. And there were so many of these birds. It says they surrounded the camp, and they were all on top of each other, because verse 31 says that they were about 2 cubits deep. So I want you to think about this. If a cubit is 18 inches, and they were 2 cubits deep. That's 36 inches. So that's 12, 24, 36, 3 feet, 3 feet deep. Quail, they're not very big birds, but these things are just stacked on top of each other, about a day's journey all around the camp, about 3 feet deep. That's nuts. God said, you want meat? I'll give you meat. And he did. It's unbelievable to think about the amount of these small birds that was around them. And we also get a picture of just how many quail or quails, I don't really know what the plural is, but how many of these quails were around them, because they spent, verse 32, all day, all night, and all of the next day gathering up these birds. There was plenty of meat for them. It even says that he who gathered the least gathered 10 homers. Now, a homer was the largest biblical measure of dry volume. And it's just like a lot of these measurements, it's debated on how much that would be. But 1 homer could be anything from 26 to 52 gallons. Okay. So at the low end, if it's 26 gallons, then the person who gathered the least gathered 260 gallons of these birds. Do you think that'd be enough to feed you for a month until you're sick of it? I think so. At the high end of that, 520 gallons of quail. I can't even fathom that number. I can't even fathom what that would look like. But to preserve this meat, it says that they spread them out for themselves all around the camp, verse 32, likely drying them out to preserve the meat. And so they are being provided for. This meat is absolutely being provided. But at the same time, we see where while the meat was still between their teeth, verse 33, before it was chewed, the anger of the Lord was kindled against them, because they had trusted and wanted to go back to Egypt and were murmuring against and rejecting God. God punished them. And so Psalm 106 says that this was a wasting disease among them because they craved intensely, or they had greedy desires. But it says at the end of verse 33, the Lord struck the people with a very severe plague. And there, verse 34, they buried those who had been greedy. Those who had been wanting more, who had been just really greedy, they had to bury them there. And so then they go to Hazeroth. So, I mean, this is unbelievable. I mean, you really think about the number, just the birds that were around. That would be unbelievable to see. The people are having this wasting disease among them. They have to bury these people who have the greedy desires. I mean, this is just an unbelievable display of who God is, just on every facet that you can think of. God is unbelievably amazing. And so this chapter has so much for us to talk about. But what I would like to do this morning is talk about the relationship between mankind and God in this chapter. And the way I'm going to put it up on the screen is in terms of we. Because as I look at the things that the Israelites were doing here, I see myself in this, and I think that we'll see ourselves as well. So as we look at some of the things that mankind does when relating to God, I hope that we will personalize this, because sometimes we undervalue God's blessings. We undervalue God's blessings. And I love that Brother Becknell in his prayer this morning, he said, thank you for all our blessings and help us never to take them for granted, something like that. I appreciated that so much, because sometimes we do undervalue God's blessings. Think about the Israelites here. The manna that God had provided for them. They didn't have to sow or tend the ground. They didn't have to keep up their garden in hopes that one day it would produce fruit. They woke up in the morning, there it is. And it was like wafers with honey. It was like cakes with oil. It was good. But because it was something that they saw every day, it became commonplace. It lost its luster. It lost the special realization that this is from God. This is God's blessing. And so the familiarity bred contempt. The familiarity bred resentment. They got used to this blessing from God, and it was no longer a blessing. It became commonplace, and it was expected. And so, speaking for myself, the same thing has got to be true today. I mean, how often do we take things for granted or feel entitled to things that are actually blessings from God that we should be unbelievably thankful for? I mean, just think about, we don't have to worry about if we're going to eat today. It's usually what are we going to eat and how many times, right? And if you're somebody here who you are worried about what you're going to eat, please let us know. This family will not let you go hungry. I promise. I just saw like 6 people's eyes, by the way, light up. I promise that's not an empty promise. So if you're worried about going hungry, we will feed you. We will. Absolutely. But also just think about we have jobs. We have the ability to work. Not everybody has that. That's a blessing from God to be able to work and provide for our families. Being able to walk. Not everybody can walk. Being able to walk is such a tremendous blessing. Being able to speak. Not everybody can do that. That's a tremendous blessing. We're just talking about physical blessings from God right now too. And we could just keep going with that list, right? Now think about the spiritual blessings from God. I mean, first and foremost, salvation because of Jesus. We can't even put words to that. We can't put a number value on that. And yet maybe, because that's what we talk about every Sunday. That's what we talk about every Wednesday. And we should be thinking about every single day of our lives. Maybe that becomes commonplace to us. And we undervalue what a blessing that is. If you're somebody that has a godly spouse, wow, that's a tremendous blessing from God, unbelievable blessing from God. And again, ashamedly speaking for myself, because we see them every day, we interact with them every day. We're like, what do you want to eat today? I don't know. What do you want to eat today? Even they can become commonplace, and we can undervalue the blessing that God has given to us. Think about this book right here. Today, think about the blessing that we have from God, that he gave us a book that reveals himself and tells us exactly how he wants us to live, who he wants us to be, who he wants us to put our trust in. And yet, I think because we have so much access today, you can get a free Bible online in minutes. Do you know that? You can, on your phone, you can get any translation you want for free. You don't even have to read it. You can have it play for you and just listen to it. And yet with all that access and all of that being a blessing, it can be such a chore sometimes just to do a daily Bible reading plan. Or on Sunday morning, when the brethren are meeting 1 hour earlier than the worship service, when we're talking about the scriptures together, that can be such a chore. I think sometimes we are all guilty of undervaluing the blessings that God has given to us. And we all do it. We all do it. And they're life-changing, and we don't need to do that. But also, from this chapter, something I notice about mankind is that we don't trust God will provide. We don't trust that God will provide. You think about the Israelites, they'd moved away from this relatively fertile area of Mount Sinai, and they're in the desert now. So when you're looking around, okay, we're in a tight spot here, because where are we going to get food? When God had been providing manna for them every day, no problem, no questions asked. And he just told them to collect it and eat it the way that he wanted them to, but not on the Sabbath, and just all of this stuff. But we see where people had greedy cravings for meat, strong desires for meat, and their hearts were in Egypt. And because of this, they longed to go back to Egypt. Do you see in Numbers 11 and verse 10, it says that all of the people were weeping throughout their camp, everyone in the tent, at the doorway of his tent. I can't even really fathom that. Like, I want meat so bad that I'm going to be crying in the door of my tent. But that's what everybody was doing, and God was angry about it. Moses was angry about it. They had these greedy desires. But even Moses here, Moses was mad at the people for their greedy desires, but even Moses doubted the ability that God would provide. You remember God said, you're going to eat meat for a month until you're sick of it and it's coming out of your nose. And Moses was like, we're 600,000 people. I mean, we got to kill all these flocks and herds. We got to get all the fish out of the sea. How are we supposed to do this? And God said, my hand's short. I'm sure he didn't do this, but the point is, my power is not limited. Don't doubt me at all. And so I really think, again, the same thing can be true for us. We don't trust that God will provide for us. It's so easy to be frazzled and experience the anxiety of, do I have enough money? Do I have enough food? Do I have enough clothing? Do I have enough house? Do I have enough whatever? You insert whatever it is. And it's so easy to have anxiety about whatever it is. And we don't trust that God will provide for us. And we can even do what the Israelites do and blame God and want to go back to a previous circumstance or cry in the doorway of our tent. And God provides for us. And he does that in a lot of different ways. One, if God has blessed you with the ability to work, then that blessing is from God. You work so that you can provide for your household. You can do all these things. God is providing for you by way of the ability to work. Or if you're doing that and yet still we can't make ends meet, we can't feed our family, the local church family, God set that up to provide for needs that Christians can't meet. And God is the one who did that. God is providing for us. And there are other ways that God provides that can't even quantify or put a number on. But I really think one of the biggest issues for us is the same thing that the Israelites had. Maybe it's not necessarily we don't believe God will provide, but the problem is we're not looking at the basic necessities of life, and we're greedy for something different. You think about the Israelites, they had food, they had the manna, but they had greedy, strong cravings for meat. They wanted something different than what God was providing for them. And we can do the same thing. We're looking for luxuries or things that we don't really need. And sometimes, just like the Israelites, we can ignore the blessings that we have because we want something else. I don't want that one. I want something else. So we can trust that God will provide for our needs. Then the last one from this chapter, and I think really the biggest one from this entire chapter, is that we limit the power of God. We limit the power of God. The Israelites wanting meat, that wasn't the problem, right? That wasn't really the problem. The problem was they were rejecting God. God says that in verse 20. He says, because you have rejected the Lord who is among you and have wept before him, saying, why did we ever leave Egypt? They were rejecting God and they were limiting his power. That's what the real problem was. Even Moses, again, think about Moses. God spoke to him directly. Moses led the people out of Egypt. I mean, think about the Red Sea. He's the one who had to spread out his staff, and he saw all that. The manna, the water, so many things. Even Moses was like, how are we going to do this? How are we going to do this? And God said, is my power limited? No way. And again, I think this is true for us today. We can limit the power of God. It could be something like, my sins are too big and my sins are too many that God won't forgive me. That's not humble. That's limiting the power of God. It could be something like, I just got a cancer diagnosis and it's pretty far along. So, maybe God will help me. I don't know. That's limiting the power of God. Or it could be, well, nobody out there wants to hear the truth of the gospel anymore, so we're just not even going to try. That's limiting the power of God. And I think that we are all guilty of that. His power is eternal, outside of our ability to even comprehend. When our focus is wrong, just like the Israelites, they're looking around, no food. When our focus is wrong, that's when we mess up and we limit God. Okay, so based on these, really quickly as we close up, I'd like to make some applications based on these. It's kind of going to be the opposite of each one of these points, and I hope that you'll see that. The first one is I think that we need to count our blessings. Count our blessings. And I mean it, like for real. This afternoon, I'm not saying you have to write it down, but maybe it would be helpful if we do. But just think about all of the blessings that God has given to us. That's what a lot of the Psalms are doing. Every single one of us has something here that bothers us, that we're struggling with, something going on that maybe nobody else will fully understand, even if we try to tell them. But no matter what we're going through, when we start counting up the blessings of God, we're going to find that that list doesn't end. There's always another thing. You might not think of it right in the moment, but there's always something else to add. God blesses us so tremendously that, again, it is beyond our ability to even quantify. We're going to sing a song, Count Your Blessings, here in a few minutes, I think. And what the end of the first verse is, count your blessings, name them one by one, and it will surprise you what the Lord has done. That's what we're talking about. When we really think about what God has blessed us with, it should just instill this deep sense of gratitude in us. But what if we don't let it surprise us? What if we're people who are constantly thinking about the blessings of God, counting our blessings all the time, that it doesn't surprise us what God is doing for us, and instill that deep sense of gratitude and give the blessings of God the value that they deserve? Okay, another one here is that we need to learn contentment. Learn contentment. And the Israelites wanting meat, again, it wasn't really the problem. The problem was they were greedy for things more than what God had already provided for them. They were greedy beyond what they needed. And God was already providing for their needs. It was greed and not trusting in God. And I think we can do the same thing. We need to learn contentment, whether it's wealth, food, clothing, house, you name it, whatever it is, we need to learn contentment, that when God provides for our needs, we must not be greedy and seek things beyond those. And sometimes that's what it is. And sometimes we ignore the provisions that God has already given to us. Learn contentment and gratitude from the blessings that we have, rather than coveting or being greedy for things that we don't have. And then the last one that I think all of this has been pointing to, and is one of the main focuses of Numbers 11, is this: is that we need to focus on the right things. We need to focus on the right things. The Israelites, as they were looking back at Egypt, they were greedy for meat, and they were all thinking about the physical things of life. They see this desert place. They're like, how are we going to eat? What are we going to do? They were thinking about this physical existence and physical things of life. If they had their focus on the God who had done all of the things already to lead them out of Egypt to where they were at that point, I really don't think these problems would have shown up. Moses says in Deuteronomy 8, verse 3, that Adam read for us before we started singing, Deuteronomy 8:3, Moses says, he humbled you and let you be hungry and fed you with manna which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you understand that man does not live by bread alone, but by everything that proceeds out of the mouth of the Lord. The purpose of the manna was not just for physical food. The purpose of manna was not physical food. This is a great point for focus on the right things, isn't it? So the purpose of the manna, Moses says, was not just for the physical satiation of their physical bodies. He says the main point of it is so that you would know that man doesn't live by bread alone, but he lives by everything that comes out of the mouth of God. It's that God provides, that God's in control. God is the one who will take care of you. That's what he wanted them to know. But because they were focused on the wrong thing, that's why they got it messed up. Do you remember who quoted that verse in the New Testament? Jesus did in Matthew 4:4 when he's being tempted by the devil. And the devil said, why don't you turn these stones into bread? You know, you just fasted for 40 days. You're hungry. Turn these stones into bread if you're the Son of God. He said, man shall not live by bread alone, but by everything that proceeds from the mouth of God. Jesus got it. He said, it's not about the physical things. God provides. God will take care. God is in control. And later on in John chapter 6, what did Jesus have to say about himself and about bread? Jesus said, your fathers, they ate the manna in the wilderness, which was called the bread from heaven. Like they ate that manna in the wilderness and they died. But Jesus said, I am the bread of life. If you eat of me, I'm the true bread of heaven. And if you eat of me, you'll live forever. And that's the bread that we need to be focused on today as well. Let's make sure that our focus is not on the physical things of life, but on the spiritual things of life and on Jesus. And so to close us out this morning, if you want to learn more about the bread of life, the bread that really matters, that's Jesus. We'd love to study with you. If you've studied and you know who Jesus is and you want to become a part of his family and be immersed in water for the remission of your sins, we'd love to do that today. Or if you've become a Christian before, but the physical things of life have choked out your faith, and you want to make that right this morning. Whatever your spiritual need is, please come to the front while we stand and while we sing.